Squash casserole with cheese is easy and delicious. In the southern United States, there is a yellow squash that is very common in the summer. It is very abundant and it is used in a lot of recipes. It's very often used with onions, either sauteed with onions on the stove or, like I'm going to do, baked with onions in a casserole. A lot of the yellow squash casserole recipes in the South just use yellow squash, but I like to use some zucchini as well. If you cannot find yellow squash, I honestly think you could make this dish with just zucchini. I am using 3 pounds of squash, 2.5 of yellow squash, and 1/2 pound of zucchini, along with 1 pound of onion. What I did is that I was thinking about squash casserole recipes that I've had in the past, and honestly they were good, but they weren't great. And I was thinking about why I didn't really like them that much and how I could improve on the old-fashioned recipe. And I realized that a lot of people, when they cut their squash, they just cut it like this and they make these circular round pieces that never really fully break down in the casserole. You can watch other YouTube videos and the squash casserole recipes, most of them, the squash never really fully disintegrates and mixes in with the onion. And I think that the reason why I didn't care for the casseroles I had in the past was that I never had all the flavors at once. It was either more squash and no onion or onion and no squash. So I said to myself, how could I make this squash casserole in a way that all the flavors are in every bite? Then I was thinking, in addition to being a southern chef, I'm also an Argentine chef. And in Argentina, people really like to grate vegetables on a cheese grater. So I thought, if I grate the squash and the zucchini on a cheese grater, it's going to be in really fine pieces and it's going to mix with the chopped onion really well. That's what I did. And then I sauteed the squash and the onions. I sauteed the vegetables in 2 batches. Per batch, I had 1 tablespoon of butter and 1 tablespoon of canola oil. I added 1/2 pound of onion and sauteed that over medium heat, gas mark 3 out of 6 for 2 minutes. Then I added the squash. The first batch was 1 pound, the second batch was 2 pounds, and I just kept stirring. The first batch, a total of 13 minutes. So 11 with the squash, and then the second batch, a total of 20 minutes, 18 minutes with the squash. The point of cooking the squash beforehand, almost all traditional southern squash casserole recipes cook the squash and onions first. And that's because squash is very watery. When you're sauteing the squash for my recipe, you'll notice that a lot of the water comes out, and instead of frying in the oil, the squash and the onions, they start to maybe not boil, but I guess steam because there's so much liquid that comes out. And here I have just over 2.25 pounds, 1,050 grams of sauteed squash and onions. And you can see it's still really watery. If you do not cook it, your squash will be like soup. So that's something to keep in mind. In order to make this not quite so watery, I'm going to add some Ritz crackers. I have 3.3 ounces or 95 grams of Ritz crackers, or you could use some other brand of butter crackers. All I'm going to do is crumble them up, put them into the zucchini, squash, and onions, and that's going to help to not only add flavor, but also absorb some of the moisture. I'm also going to add some creaminess. Almost all the recipes have creaminess. Very often condensed cream of mushroom soup, sometimes mayo, but I'm going to use 1 cup or 240 grams of sour cream, to which I'm going to add 1 packet of onion soup mix, about 27 grams. I have been using this a lot recently. I'm kind of obsessed with it. It's just so full of flavor. It's so easy. No reason why not to use it. So I am going to mix this together. Put this off to the side. Of course, I'm going to add some cheese. I'm adding 1 8-ounce block of sharp cheddar, half of which will go into the casserole, the other half on top, along with a 1/4 cup or 60 grams of sour cream. I'm going through a sour cream phase as well. I'm going to add 1 egg just to bind everything together, and I may add more crackers on the top in the topping. I'm not sure. It'll add a nice bit of extra crunch, but I will decide what I'm doing as I make this. I have an 8x8 casserole dish that is lightly buttered, waiting. Now what I'm going to do is just simply add the sour cream to the squash and onions and mix thoroughly. I added the sour cream and onion soup mix to the squash and onions, and now I'm going to add the crumbled up Ritz crackers along with half of the cheese. I just finished mixing in the cheese and the Ritz crackers. I tasted it and it's good, but I feel like it needs a little bit more. Before adding your egg, whenever you're making a squash and onions casserole with cheese or just any casserole, make sure that you taste it. You may need to add other spices. I'm going to add a dash of salt along with a 1/4 teaspoon each of garlic powder, onion powder, black pepper, basil, parsley, and oregano. Just going to crush it in my fingers and add it like this. I mixed in the spices, I tasted it, and it's really good. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a 1/4 teaspoon of each spice or half of a teaspoon, so I erred on the side of caution and just did a 1/4 teaspoon first. Like I said, if you are unsure, start small, as you can always add more, but it's hard to take away. Now that I'm happy with how it tastes, I have my egg and I'm going to add it to the squash and onions. I'm going to mix this together. My oven is preheating to 350, and once this is mixed, I'm going to put it into my slightly buttered 8x8 casserole dish. I put the filling into the casserole dish and I smooth it out with my spoon. Now I'm ready for the topping. I already mixed together the sour cream and the cheese, and I decided to go with some extra Ritz crackers on the top. I think they're going to add some nice crunch and a nice buttery flavor. So I took half of a 3.3 ounce sleeve, and I didn't crush them totally like I'm making a graham cracker crust. I just crushed them into pieces like this. I'm going to sprinkle this on the top. I think I'm only going to use half of a sleeve for the top, but we'll see. This filling is really soft, as you saw, so I'm going to have to put on the cheese and sour cream topping in a different way. Maybe not different, in a more careful way. Instead of putting down, for lack of a better word, globs and then spreading them out, I'm going to take this in my fingers and I'm going to try to crumble it as best I can over the crackers. In the oven, the cheese will melt and the sour cream will help the cheese to spread out over the top of the casserole. I decided to just crumble the other half of the sleeve of Ritz crackers on top of the squash casserole with cheese. So in this 13.7 ounce box of crackers, There were 4 sleeves. I used 2 of the 4, so half the box. This is going into a 350 degree oven for, I'm guessing, 30 minutes, but I'll let you know. I just took my squash casserole with cheese out of the oven. It was in at 350, uncovered, for 30 minutes. Although it was very tempting, I waited 30 minutes to dig in. When I finally cut into and tried my squash casserole with cheese, I found out just how delicious it was. This casserole was the best. The yellow squash, the zucchini, Ritz crackers, cheese, sour cream, and onion soup mix all coming together to make something amazing. Just as I had expected, grating the zucchini and yellow squash on a cheese grater was perfect because it allowed for a bit of squash and onions in every bite. Although a can of condensed soup is a common addition to a classic southern squash casserole, I'm glad that I went with sour cream and then onion soup mix. The sour cream added creaminess and the soup mix added a lot of flavor. The sour cream also added some tanginess, which definitely added to the flavor. The Ritz crackers helped to absorb some of the moisture. As you saw, squash and zucchini are really watery. And the Ritz crackers on top, along with the browned and bubbly cheese, created a nice, crispy, crunchy texture. Honestly, I think that the contrast in textures was one of the strong points of this casserole. The only thing that I would have done differently is that instead of only a quarter teaspoon of the additional spices, I think a full half a teaspoon would be better. As I said earlier in the video, I've had squash and onions casserole in the past, and honestly, it was okay, but it wasn't spectacular. But this recipe was one of the best, if not the best, that I've ever had. As a chef, I think it's always fun to try to improve recipes by using different ingredients like onion soup mix or different techniques like the Argentine technique of grating vegetables on a cheese grater to change and improve dishes that you already know without totally changing the concept. I also wanted to point out that just like with my sweet cherry pie, this squash and cheese casserole was actually the second attempt this summer. As you know, I've been making a lot of savory pies recently, and this started out as a savory pie. But in the pie form, I didn't add the onion soup mix, and instead of adding sour cream to the topping, I just did crushed Ritz crackers and cheese. Although it was good, I learned that adding sour cream to the topping is really important because if you don't, the cheese and the crackers will form a crust that is very difficult to cut through. Like I said, this casserole was absolutely delicious, so I hope that you give it a try. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.